Hello, Ozazis here. Just doing something a little bit different. I had originally planned to do this before the Dreadshaw patch dropped, but I left it too long, and then pre-patch notes and balance changes were done, so I didn't feel as comfortable doing it. But so we're doing a tier list today instead of a guide or some gameplay. Uh, Reasoning for this, I just think they're kind of useful sometimes. Obviously, they're very subjective. There's a lot of opinion involved in the in tier lists, so take anything, take any tiers here with a grain of salt. Uh, for those that haven't really, I should probably define the tiers here because everyone kind of has like a different view of it. So S, so it's supposed to be like superb, and then like a regular Reddit, letter grading, letter grading system. But for S, anything in S, I think is probably a little bit too strong. So the things in S, when we get to them, will are things that I suspect may need a bit of toning down, a little bit of a nerf. Um, they're probably too good in too many situations, or just way too good at the thing that they're good at. Um, like individual things may vary, but we'll come to that when we get to it. A Anything in A, I think could be in S, maybe, but you can't really say for certain. Like maybe it's not as clear cut. Maybe they're just good at matching up against something in S, and once the thing that's in S is toned down, the you may not. I may feel differently, and it may not need it anymore. Um, that, but this I feel is still a little bit more powerful than like the baseline. B and C would be the baseline for me. Um, so B is like it's almost impossible to be like exactly at the baseline. You're probably going to feel either slightly good or slightly bad. If everything was in B, I think that would be a good state for the game, assuming there was variation. Like assuming everything was still different, but everything felt fair and balanced, but also no matter what choice you make, it kind of feels good. That would be great. Whereas C is like like it's kind of there, but it's not quite. Like it kind of feels like a little bad. D is still has some uses, but it's starting to feel pretty dodgy. Um, the anything in here I wouldn't necessarily recommend, and F is like complete failures. These are things that the only reason you would ever run is because it is weak and you're just looking for difficulty. Um, the so we'll get started with that. Okay, so we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up. And the first thing I'm going to grab is the Fury's Edge, and I'm going to put it in D. I don't actually think there's anything in that justifies an F in the game currently. Everything on the Raider side has a use. Um, so we're pretty good with this. But the Fury's Edge has just a really bad offensive profile. It can only hit things, it only has like 1.8 meter range as opposed to Sledge Blade's 2. And then the lunge is like half of the distance of the Sledge Blade, so it can't make use of that either. And then the lunge also hurts its ability to use its trait, which is its like one redeeming feature, so it can deflect projectiles, but then it can't do it while it's lunging, unless it's at the end of the lunge, and yeah, there's whole shenanigans with that. Um, but what it boils down to for me for why Fury's Edge is in D tier is that it does have some uses, particularly it hard counters bolt shot traps. It's a very good hard counter to bolt shot traps. Most of the other things that it actually has advantage against are much easier to deal with by just moving slightly because most of the other projectiles are fairly small. Ravages are probably the current Ravages with the circle pattern are probably the least probably the most the next most useful case, because those ones it's harder to move out of because that bolt is quite large, but it's still nothing. It's still next to nothing. And you still have to deal with the Ravager, which you don't have to deal with bolt shots. So that is why I put Fury's Edge in D. I do not generally recommend that as a weapon. It is there are certain cases like dual sword where it's better than the sum of its parts, but generally speaking, the Fury's Edge needs a lot of help to really come together. Uh, for other thing in D, we're going to put the spike drive. The reason for this is the spike drive is only really helpful for trying to get your time down in a non-blind speedrun. In blind speedruns, you can't really afford to do it because you don't know when you're going to be able to make efficient use of them, and most of the other hardware saving you from that unexpected death is probably better. But in regular speedruns, you can knock off a couple seconds by moving slightly faster if you don't need both your hardware slots to do your line of play. But the biggest problem with it is it's only 4 seconds of 45% movement speed, and movement speed doesn't affect grappling, so generally speaking, it's only going to be used to set up the grapple that could be getting you to move faster. Obviously, map uh, maps matter in this case. Like if you're going through a zigzag corridor, using a spike drive is better. And there are times when you need to like 180, particularly at the gen mats, where a spike drive can be helpful to get you slightly further while you're setting up the grapple, and that might get you further along before the second wave traps activate, which might allow you to skip, say, a timed death piston that's set up to try and kill someone that runs at full speed. But they're honestly very few and far between. It doesn't have any like intrinsic helpfulness because like you can't like outrun a bolt shot or something. And generally speaking, you're going to be running towards the trap that you're trying to deal with, so it doesn't actually really help you like skip things that often. At least, and if you could skip them with the spike drive, you could probably also have just skipped them with the grappling hook, and the grappling hook doesn't take up a loadout slot. So that's why I put spike drive here. I just think that it's mostly invalidated by the grappling hook, but there are some like edge cases where it's pretty good. Well, where it's useful. Still think it's a little marginal. Okay, for C. So we're starting to get to the spot where I think things are reasonable, and I'm going to put the Sledge Blade here. I think the Sledge Blade, its stats and whatnot are all fairly fine. The 8-meter lunge, the high lunge speed, the 2-meter range and hitbox, and the shenanigans with the best damage type, so it can destroy armor. So if you accidentally hit the armor of something, which is really common with melee weapons, because with melee weapons, enemies are broken up into 3 zones: head, uh, torso, legs, as opposed to ranged weapons where if it hits something that's squishy, it will still kill. That doesn't actually happen with melee weapons, unfortunately. So having that extra strong damage type is really important. And the like 1.3 second cooldown is not super it's not great. It's pretty long for what it is, but it's also not so bad that the Sledge Blade becomes useless. You're still able to hit a guard that is in the stun from breaking its armor before it can react, so at that point, that's all you can really ask for, and if it gets too much faster, it would actually probably become the best way to get around most maps. because you'd be able to outrun the traps that are just activated using some of the Kamitachi perks. The biggest problem I think with the Sledge Blade is that it needs support that is both offensive and defensive. That's kind of where the Fury's Edge and Dual Sword comes into play. It needs something that is, uh, yeah, it needs something that's offensive because it's going to put itself in a bad spot a lot of the time when it tries to deal with armor, but it needs something that's defensive because it you generally need something that's defense. Like if you have no defenses in one weapon, you kind of want it in the other. It's part of the reason why the arc barrier is so good. Um, but it I don't think the perfect complementary weapon exists for it, so it ends up in a bad spot a lot of the time. Particularly when you have to deal with like certain incinerator setups. You can deal with them, it's just harder, and that's why I think it's C rather than B. Because it does feel really good to like zoom around the map using the lunges on Sledgeblade, but you just end up in some difficult situations with certain setups that are fairly common, typically to do with bombs or incinerators, depending on what you take as your secondary weapon. Okay, so for B, let's start with the demo cannon, because I'm typically starting with the weapons here. Uh, Demo Cannon, it's the newest weapon in the game. It's quite good. It has a lot of useful situations. You can shoot around corners. You can ignore armor on guards. You can uh, destroy complicated setups with a single shot, and sometimes just by accident, which is really good and can make things that would have otherwise been quite difficult to deal with quite easy. um, which is why I think it's in B. It also has some really clear deficiencies that mean that it doesn't become like super overpowered. It's really bad about dealing with hornets that are in the air. You can do it. It's just you have to line up shots. There are certain weird things with certain weird angles that are hard to hit, like if a trap is on the roof or on a downward slope. Both of those can be quite difficult to line up. There are tricks for it, you can always hit them, but it's not always the easiest. And because of that, I think it justifies its spot in like B. I think it's a fairly good balanced weapon. It is definitely fun to use. Um, it feels good, but not like the best weapon in the game. So I think for me, I would put this in a B tier. On a similar point, the Kamitachi suit, I will put in B. The quick strikes and the frenzy biolinks both feel really good. Gap closer honestly feels bad, and I do not like it, and I don't use it, which is part of the reason it's in B because like those other two feel good, but not like completely game breaking, and they definitely have their spots, but having like two perks that are like that, I think would probably have put it up to A if it wasn't for the fact that the third perk is actually really bad. If I if Gap Closer was better, or if the melee weapons suited Gap Closer, like I think the Sledge Blade kind of wants Gap Closer, but you really don't want it with Fury's Edge, which is part of the problem. So because of that, I think it's a B B spot, and I think suits should be a little bit stronger, so maybe they should be in A, where it's a little bit more suspect because the biolinks need to change up the playstyles a little bit more um, to justify their existence, but we're not quite there with the Kamitachi suit at the moment. And the last thing I want to put into the B is the blast grenade. Similar reasons to the demo cannon, but because it takes up a load up slot instead of a weapon, obviously you only get 3 shots now, the 3 shots then, but that can be really impactful and can really minimize the difficulty of dealing with certain situations. Like I've already mentioned incinerator setups before with the sledge blade. I normally run blast grenades when I'm playing a melee focused loadout because it allows me to deal with those setups trivially, and if there's more than four, I can bring out the text to deal with them on. I can deal, yeah, bring out the text to deal with them properly, but I just don't need to most of the time because there's not generally more than four. There's not generally four or more of those setups on any given map. So I think it's very good. I just don't think it's quite as good as the other two, which we are about to get to. Um, okay, so A, we're starting to get to the point where these things might be a little too strong. Um, Depending on how other balance changes happen, I would not be surprised to see something in A drop down or up, to drop either up into S or down into B. It could go either way. It depends whether it depends like what changes. Like for instance, let's start with the Falconic Plasma Bow. Falconic Plasma Bow, I think, is an A tier because guards are generally scarier than traps, and Falconic Plasma Bow makes them trivially easy. So it turns something that would normally be quite difficult and makes it very easy. And because of that, I think that it deserves a spot in A. But if we start seeing better traps, and if we start seeing more better traps, we could see Falconic Plasma Bow fall down into B, but if most of the threat still comes from guards, it could even go up into S, particularly if the trend continues where traps are generally quite slow. There are some exceptions, incinerators, plasma sentinels, uh, can be bomb traps as well. Can be difficult to deal with the plasma bow. You can do a little bit on bomb traps with the plasma bow, but yeah, it just depends on how the trap meta goes going forward for whether it changes. But I think at the moment, guards are the main threat, generally speaking, and you can get a weapon that deals with those other threats pretty easily. Typically, Bolt Lancer, I would say, would be the best thing to pair with Plasma Bow, but there's it handles something that it handles like a lot of threats. Like every guard is a threat in this game, and it is so good against guards that it is worth that it is probably a little bit too strong just because of you know nearly infinite ammo and the fact it has such a good shooting pattern. Like it's nearly perfectly straight and a really fast projectile speed. Next up, we have Ironside. Now, I mentioned before that I think that suits probably have it probably should be a little bit higher because they do need to change up the gameplay a little bit to justify their biolinks. Like their biolinks need to be like changing up the gameplay because if they're not, then what he would you select those? Why would you even buy that suit? Obviously, it's a bit different with Ironside because that's the starter one, and Ironside does do that to an extent, and the the perk that is actually probably the worst is part of what changes up the gameplay, which I think is why I think it's a A tier here. So the three perks on it are Magnetic Link, which increases your ammo grab range from 4 meters to 6 meters. Um, that means that you can grab things through walls. There's the 20% faster fire rate. That's also really good anytime you're using a ranged weapon. Being able to fire 20% faster, can't really complain about that. It's not as useful in the plasma mode because it already fires so fast and it requires aiming, and you're not going to be able to re-aim in the like 0.4 seconds most most people will not be able to re-aim in the 0.4 seconds to snipe the next guard, but the it's still very useful, particularly with the other two weapons, and the the one that's kind of suspect, being able to see your ammo through walls at up to 40-meter range, that's kind of dodgy. That wouldn't really be a particularly great biolink, but because Magnetic Link lets you pick up through walls, it gives you enough range to pick up through one block walls, you can actually make really good use of it. And the combination of those is all really good. But it could potentially be S tier, arguably, if other things, depending on how other things shake out. At the moment, I think the it's not. I think the once we get to the S tier, you'll see why I consider these ones more powerful, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now we've got the two. I'm going to go over both of these at the same time because I think they are both good for very similar reasons. So the Flash Barrier and the Phoenix Pod, I put in A. They both save you a lot of hassle and potentially uh, let you do some very significantly different tricks when it comes to your raids. In both cases, they are very good at allowing you to go further in your run. The Phoenix Pod obviously gives up one death to the builder, which is nice, but it's also probably stronger than the Flash Barrier because you can place it down beforehand, but then there's the shenanigans around the Gen Mat, which the Flash Barrier is better at handling. And in both cases, they're very good at dealing with just about everything. It is hard to find a situation where if I could just get down a Phoenix Pod or Flash Barrier in the right spots, that it's not going to be uh, like really, really strong. The only I only ever use these three consumables. I don't use the Spike Drive pretty much ever because these three consumables exist, and I only use this one because it has a really good edge case when I'm using entirely melee weapons. These two are very strong, and it's worth unlocking the Flash Barrier, so if you are planning on sticking with the range side of things, just to have like a better loadout for dealing with more things. And I don't think it's so bad at the moment that I would consider these things broken. Um, but they're definitely stronger, and it's really hard to imagine something that could be stronger than them and not broken. Um, which I think is part of the problem with all of these. Like, if a plasma bow existed that also destroyed traps, this would be 100% S tier. Um, like, if you increased anything on plasma bow, I think it would be S tier. Same with Ironside, and I think that's kind of where the A tier is falling out, as opposed to the B, where they still do occasionally feel pretty good, but they're I think you could buff any of these and it wouldn't necessarily be broken, but I don't necessarily think it would be good for the game. So maybe this one. Maybe I should move the I don't think I can justify moving the suits around. Um let's go into the last tier. Okay, so for S, I'm going to start with the Volt Lancer, because the last two you really need to speak about at the same time. The Volt Lancer is the best offensive weapon in the game. It is good at all ranges. It has a reasonable amount of ammo. It has the best damage type in the game. Uh, and it there are options that you can take to remove its one weakness of ammo traps. I actually don't think the Volt Lancer is like super far into the S tier. My biggest problem with the Volt Lancer is because I think it's reasonable at a long range. Like the amount of drop off makes it actually kind of hard to land the shots, which is fine. At a medium range, that's when it works best, and that's pretty good. My biggest problem with it is that it's already good at both of those ranges, but then it's also the best. It's probably the best melee weapon in the game. And I think if it just became not the best melee weapon in the game, then the I think it would be in a fine spot. The biggest problem is between Magnetic Link and the already 4 meter range that you have, it already is better than the Fury's Edge because it can hit at the same speed and destroy armor, which of course triggers the armor break stun. But it also has the bits where that you can't have on melee weapons, where the you can hit between the armor plates and the fact that you basically have infinite ammo at short ranges because you will just pick up the ammo immediately. You only the only the lunge on the um sledge blade is actually longer than the pickup range, but that also puts you in danger because you have to move towards the enemy. Like I I remember I built a Warmonger Horde shenanigan on day one of Meet Your Maker, and the only people that could beat it without using consumables were people using Volt Lancer because they could stand just close enough that they were picking up their ammo constantly and just shoot into the horde of Warmongers. And that's an edge case, right? But there are a lot of cases like that. Like I think incinerators um, are only fine in this game because the Volt Lancer is a pretty hard counter to them because if you can set up an incinerator, you can normally hit it with a Volt Lancer and the bolt sticks in, so you can just go grab the bolt most of the time. Whereas every other weapon kind of has difficulty with dealing with them, particularly the melee ones. Um, and even the arc barrier, which we haven't got to yet, has trouble dealing with incinerators because of how the timings of the flames run out. But Volt Lancer, it's a starter weapon. It's very strong. It just needs something, and there are ways you could make it weaker without significantly impacting its medium and long range. The best one I think can think of was probably the level 3 upgrade that lowers its attack reload reload speed or whatever it's called from 2 seconds to 1 second. Like if that just was like 1.5 instead, or 1.3, something more reasonable, um, then all of a sudden it's not like attacking stupidly fast at all times, and um, then it's no longer the best melee weapon because it's kind of slow firing. And at that point, I think that it would probably drop down, and that would probably be better for the game, though there are a few too many people that complain about the game being too hard, so we'll see if that actually comes to pass or not. But I don't think it's quite as problematic as the next two we're about to talk to because they combo well together. Which obviously it's the Arc Barrier and the Nautilus. At this point, they are the combination of the two. The combination of the two is obvious because the Nautilus suit is for defensive weapons, and there's only one defensive weapon, and that is the Arc Barrier. So sure, we know why that is all. We know why they're combining, but the Arc Barrier was probably already one of the best weapons in the game. Well, I say probably. The Arc Barrier was one of the best weapons in the game even before the Nautilus came out, and the Nautilus just makes it stronger. And the biggest problem with the Nautilus, Arc Barrier combination is that the Nautilus biolinks all focus on the Arc Barrier, which already has some pretty good numbers, but all three biolinks are amazing. The one that increases the perfect block effect uh, makes the arc barrier last nearly twice as long, over twice as long if you compare the non-perfect block versus perfect block, because it goes from 1.5 to 3.5 seconds. That's insane to start with. Has some like functional uses that I quite like, that I think are fun on paper, but it's really strong in practice. The cooldown as well. Uh, I don't think I don't think the cooldown perk is actually that bad, except for the fact that it brings down the already fairly low um, uptime to some fairly ridiculous numbers. Um, like what else was there? The last one is the perfect block timing going up by zero point 0.5 seconds. That I don't think is that is obviously the worst of the three perks, but it's a strict increase in power of one of the numbers. It's not like a utility perk. It's still pretty good. There's no downsides to it ever. There are some like weirdness where you're you can get hit by something that you thought you would have been safe from because the timings doesn't quite line up, but they would have if you didn't have the perk and still got a perfect block. But if you didn't have the perk, you and that situation had occurred, you would have missed the perfect block, and maybe you would have known to get out of the way or something. Because one of the biggest uses I like to use it for is to perfect block, say, an impaler and then wait out the explosion. And if you have the perk where your perfect block timing is longer, you may not have a full 2 seconds. Though you should, because it adds 2 seconds. Never mind, actually you will. There was something else I'm trying to remember. Um, anyway, yeah, so the Nautilus makes the arc barrier just like insanely powerful, and the uptime goes through the roof. It could be pretty easily fixed, honestly. The one of the easiest fixes I can think of would be to just not have the cooldown start until the end of the effect. Um, then the uptimes go significantly lower, and you can keep the really powerful and good feeling effect of the current arc barrier and Nautilus, but you wouldn't be able to see people just running through maps because they're only vulnerable for like a third of the time, not even a third of the time. And it's really easy to find a like 1.6 second window, considering most traps take um, about 1.25 seconds to activate. So you only really need to find like a 0.4 second spot to stand still and then move into another space, and then you'll still have your arc barrier up before the next trap hits you. Really, really silly. Um, and yeah, the combination of the two is insane. Um, doesn't help that the arc barrier is the only defensive weapon, so it's hard to compare it because it is the only other thing that has any form of defense is Fury's Edge, and I think that's just way too weak in general. But the like any other defensive weapon, even if it was on par with the arc barrier, would be way too strong. Like you can't introduce. If I could run two arc barriers, this game would be insanely easy. Um, which isn't, which shouldn't be the case. And that's kind of where the S tier is falling. Like any one of these, if I could run two of them, would be like either of these weapons. If I could run two of that weapon, would be way too strong. I would be destroying the whole game, like every map, so easily. And People will gravitate towards what's kind of strong. So you'll note if you ever looking at your replays, you'll notice everyone runs at least one of these. You'll occasionally see the dual sword players, but they're nowhere near as common as talk about dual swords is. But anyway, we are done with all of the raider options. I'm going to try and do the builder options next week, which we're going to break it down as guards and traps, because there's no point talking about every single mod individually just yet. Uh, I will probably try to make this a regular thing for each sector, so every 3 months we'll come back and update this. But for now, and at some point I'll probably break up the suits into individual perks, but for now, this is my feelings on the balance. You'll notice that on the Raider side, it is actually pretty highly skewed towards overpowered, which leads to some of the complaints that people have about the um, Raiders being too strong, which I think is full about the game being too easy and Raiders being too strong, which I think is fully justified. Uh, this is it. We're done here. Next week will be the builder tier list. Hopefully this helps if you're looking to try and, make the game easier or harder for yourself. You can select options here that are stronger or weaker to help out. But if you have any thoughts or want to discuss, comment section down below would be the best place for that. I do read every comment. Uh, but yeah, I'll be back next week with the builder side stuff.